The grand halls of palace echoed with an unusual tension as the evening shadows stretched across the marble floors. Queen stood by the ornate window of her private study, watching the last rays of sunlight disappear behind the London skyline. Her fingers drummed nervously against the windowsill, a habit she had developed during the most stressful moments of her reign. Tonight was different from all the others, and she could feel the weight of expectation pressing down upon her shoulders like a heavy crown. For months had been carefully orchestrating what she believed would be her defining moment as queen consort. The annual royal charity gala was approaching, and she had taken it upon herself to completely revolutionize the event. This wasn't just about raising funds for worthy causes. It was about establishing her authority, proving to the world that she could command respect and admiration in ways that would eclipse even the most beloved members of the royal family. The plan had seemed flawless when she first conceived it during those quiet hours after midnight, when the palace was shrouded in darkness and her mind was free to wander. She would transform the traditionally formal gala into something spectacular, something that would capture the imagination of not just the British public, but the entire world. Celebrity performers would grace the stage, international dignitaries would compete for invitations, and the media would have no choice but to acknowledge her as the driving force behind the most successful royal event in decades. But as reviewed the latest reports from her personal secretary, the confidence that had sustained her through months of meticulous planning began to crack like ice under pressure. The RSVPs were not flowing in as expected. Several high-profile celebrities had politely declined, citing scheduling conflicts that seemed suspiciously convenient. Foreign dignitaries were responding with diplomatic noncommitments that left her wondering whether they would actually attend. A woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled back in a perfect chignon had served the royal family for over 30 years. She had witnessed the rise and fall of numerous royal initiatives, and her experience had taught her to read the subtle signs that indicated when a project was heading toward disaster. As she placed the latest correspondence on his mahogany desk, her expression remained professionally neutral, but her eyes betrayed a hint of concern. "Your Majesty," began carefully, "I've received responses from the final group of invitees. I'm afraid the numbers are not quite what we had hoped for." She paused, choosing her words with diplomatic precision. "Perhaps we should consider adjusting our expectations for the evening." Turned from the window, her blue eyes flashing with a mixture of frustration and determination. She had not come this far in life by accepting defeat at the first sign of obstacles. Her journey to the throne had been fraught with challenges that would have broken lesser individuals, and she had no intention of allowing this setback to diminish her resolve. "Adjusting expectations is not an option," replied, her voice carrying the authority she had worked so hard to cultivate. "This gala will proceed exactly as planned. If certain individuals lack the vision to recognize the significance of what we're creating, then perhaps they're not the caliber of people we want associated with our cause anyway." Even as she spoke these words, felt a gnawing doubt in the pit of her stomach. She had invested not just her reputation in this event, but also significant royal resources. The palace staff had been working overtime for weeks. Designers had been commissioned to create elaborate decorations, and catering arrangements had been made for hundreds of guests. The thought of the gala falling short of expectations was almost too painful to contemplate. Meanwhile, in the east wing of the palace, Princess of Wales was experiencing a very different kind of evening. She sat in her cozy private sitting room, surrounded by thank-you letters from children who had participated in her recent early childhood development initiative. The letters were written in crayon and colored pencils, filled with drawings of rainbows and stick figures that represented the joy these young people had experienced through her programs. Kate, as she was affectionately known to the public, had spent the day visiting a primary school in East London, where she had launched a new mental health awareness program for young students. The visit had not been planned with fanfare or media spectacle in mind. Instead, it had been organized with the simple goal of making a genuine difference in the lives of children who needed support and encouragement. During her visit, Kate had sat on tiny plastic chairs designed for 5-year-olds, listened to their concerns about everything from friendship problems to worries about their parents, and helped them plant seeds in small pots that they would take home to nurture. The media coverage had been minimal by royal standards, but the impact had been profound. Teachers reported that the children had been talking about the visit all afternoon, and several parents had already called the school to ask how they could become involved in the mental health program. As Kate read through the letters, each one more heartwarming than the last, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment that had nothing to do with public recognition or media attention. This was why she had accepted the responsibilities that came with her royal title. This was the work that made all the protocol and ceremony worthwhile. Her husband, Prince William, entered the room carrying 2 cups of tea, a nightly ritual they had maintained throughout their marriage. He set 1 cup beside Kate and settled into the chair across from her, observing the contentment that seemed to radiate from her as she read the children's messages. "Another successful day of changing the world one child at a time," William said with genuine admiration in his voice. He had watched Kate evolve from a shy young woman who had been thrust into the spotlight into a confident, compassionate leader who seemed to instinctively understand how to connect with people from all walks of life. Kate looked up from the letters, her green eyes sparkling with emotion. "You should have seen them, William. There was this one little girl, Sophie, who was so shy she wouldn't speak to anyone. But when we started planting the seeds, she opened up completely. She told me about her grandmother who taught her to garden before she passed away. By the end of the afternoon, she was helping other children with their plants." The difference between Kate's approach and could not have been more pronounced. While was orchestrating grand gestures designed to capture headlines and establish her legacy, Kate was focusing on personal connections and genuine impact. She didn't need elaborate events or celebrity endorsements to validate her work. The thank you letters from children, the reports from teachers about improved classroom behavior, and the emails from parents expressing gratitude were all the validation she required. But the royal household is a complex ecosystem where individual actions and successes rarely occur in isolation. As the palace staff prepared for another day of managing the competing priorities and personalities of the royal family, whispers began to circulate about the contrasting approaches being taken by the 2 most prominent female members of the family. In the servants' quarters, conversations over late-night cups of tea inevitably turned to comparisons between the Queen Consort's elaborate gala preparations and the Princess of Wales's grassroots community work. The staff members, who had dedicated their careers to serving the royal family, found themselves privately questioning which approach was more effective in advancing the monarchy's mission of public service. James, the head butler who had served the palace for over 20 years, found himself in an uncomfortable position. His loyalty to the royal family was absolute, but his observations of the 2 women's different styles had led him to some troubling conclusions. His demanding schedule and perfectionist expectations had created a stressful atmosphere among the staff, while Kate's genuine appreciation for their efforts and her willingness to adjust her plans to accommodate their needs had earned her their deep respect and affection. During a brief conversation with Mrs. Henderson, the head housekeeper, James expressed his concerns in carefully measured terms. "It seems to me that Her Majesty is under tremendous pressure to make this gala a success," he observed. "Perhaps more pressure than is entirely necessary." Mrs. Henderson, a practical woman who had managed royal households through numerous crises and celebrations, nodded thoughtfully. "The Princess of Wales has a different approach entirely," she replied. "She seems to understand that the most meaningful work often happens away from the cameras and the headlines." These conversations, while conducted with the utmost discretion and loyalty, reflected a growing awareness among the palace staff that they were witnessing something significant. The 2 women represented different philosophies of royal duty, and their contrasting approaches were beginning to create ripple effects throughout the entire royal household. As the clock in the palace tower chimed midnight, remained at her desk, poring over guest lists and making last-minute adjustments to the gala program. The weight of her ambitious plans was beginning to feel overwhelming, but she refused to acknowledge the possibility that she might have overreached. Her determination to succeed was matched only by her fear of failure, and that fear was driving her to work longer hours and demand more from everyone around her. In her private moments, when the facade of royal confidence could be set aside, found herself questioning whether her grand vision was truly serving the best interests of the monarchy or merely satisfying her own need to prove herself worthy of the crown she wore. But these moments of doubt were quickly suppressed, replaced by renewed determination to make the gala a triumph that would silence any critics and establish her as a formidable force within the royal family. The irony was not lost on those who observed both women that the harder work to manufacture success, the more effortless Kate's genuine impact appeared to be. While struggled with declining RSVPs and mounting pressure, Kate's calendar was filling up with requests from organizations desperate for her involvement in their causes. Schools, hospitals, and charitable organizations had learned that the Princess of Wales brought something invaluable to their work, authentic engagement that created lasting positive change. As the first part of this emotional tale draws to a close, the stage has been set for a confrontation between two very different approaches to royal duty and public service. After Dark Command, built on grand gestures and elaborate planning, is beginning to show signs of weakness. Meanwhile, Kate's quiet, consistent work is steadily building a foundation of genuine support and admiration that may prove to be far more powerful than any single spectacular event. The palace walls that have witnessed centuries of royal triumphs and failures are about to witness another chapter in the ongoing story of how true leadership is earned, not commanded, and how authentic connection with people's hearts and minds ultimately proves more valuable than any amount of pomp and circumstance. The morning sun cast long shadows through the palace corridors as emerged from another restless night. Her usually immaculate appearance showed subtle signs of the stress that had been building over the past weeks. Dark circles beneath her eyes, despite the careful application of concealer, betrayed the countless hours she had spent poring over every detail of the approaching gala. Her personal maid, Sarah, had noticed that the Queen Consort's morning routine had become increasingly lengthy, as if the extra time spent on appearance could somehow mask the anxiety that seemed to follow her like a persistent shadow. The breakfast room, typically a place of quiet dignity where royal family members began their days with measured conversation, and the morning papers, had become a theater of barely concealed tension. Sat at her usual place at the polished oak table, mechanically stirring her tea while her mind raced through the endless list of concerns that had kept her awake until dawn. Her private secretary approached with the morning correspondence, her steps more hesitant than usual. In her hands were several letters that she knew would not improve her employer's mood. The latest responses from potential gala attendees continued to trend in the wrong direction, and there were whispers from the media that some journalists were beginning to question whether the event would live up to the grandiose promises that had been made. "Your Majesty," began delicately, "there have been several developments regarding the gala that require your attention." She placed a neat stack of papers beside untouched breakfast, her expression carefully neutral. Years of experience had taught her that delivering disappointing news to members of the royal family required a particular combination of honesty and tact. Looked up from her teacup, her blue eyes reflecting a weariness that went beyond mere physical exhaustion. "How many more cancellations?" she asked, her voice carrying the weight of someone who already knew the answer would not be what she hoped to hear. "3 more high-profile guests have cited unexpected conflicts," replied carefully. "Additionally, there have been some concerns raised by the palace communications team about managing expectations for media coverage. They're suggesting that we might want to adjust our press strategy to focus more on the charitable aspects of the event rather than the celebrity attendance." The suggestion struck like a physical blow. The celebrity attendance had been the cornerstone of her vision for the gala, the element that would differentiate her event from every other royal function and establish her as someone who could command respect from the world's most influential figures. To abandon that focus felt like admitting defeat before the battle had even been fought. "Absolutely not," responded firmly, though her voice carried a slight tremor that betrayed her inner turmoil. "We will not retreat from our original vision. If certain individuals lack the foresight to associate themselves with what will undoubtedly be remembered as a watershed moment for the monarchy, then that is their loss, not ours." Even as she spoke these defiant words, felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. The confidence that had sustained her through months of planning was being eroded by a series of small but significant setbacks that seemed to be mounting with each passing day. The elaborate decorations she had commissioned were proving more expensive than anticipated. The catering arrangements were becoming increasingly complex, and the media interest that she had expected to build naturally was requiring more and more aggressive promotion from the palace communications team. Meanwhile, across the city, Kate was beginning her day in a very different manner. She had risen early to prepare for a visit to a women's shelter in South London, where she would be meeting with survivors of domestic violence to discuss a new support program that her foundation had been developing. Unlike Gala, this visit had been planned with minimal fanfare and maximum substance. Kate stood in her dressing room, carefully selecting an outfit that would be appropriate for the sensitive nature of her visit. She chose a simple navy dress that was elegant but not ostentatious, paired with comfortable shoes that would allow her to move easily through the shelter's facilities. Her approach to royal fashion had always been guided by the principle that her clothing should never overshadow the people she was meeting or the causes she was supporting. Her lady-in-waiting helped her review the briefing materials that had been prepared for the visit. The documents contained detailed information about each woman Kate would be meeting, their backgrounds, and the challenges they had overcome. Kate read through every page carefully, making notes in the margins, and asking thoughtful questions about how her foundation's new program could best serve these brave women. The shelter director mentioned that many of the residents have expressed interest in job training programs, noted as she reviewed the schedule for the visit. They're particularly interested in opportunities that would allow them to develop skills they could use to become financially independent. Kate nodded thoughtfully, already beginning to formulate ideas about how her foundation could support these aspirations. We should explore partnerships with local businesses and training institutions, she mused. But more importantly, we need to make sure that any program we develop is designed with their input. They know better than anyone what kind of support would be most meaningful. This attention to detail and genuine concern for the people she would be meeting stood in stark contrast to focus on the logistics of her gala. While worried about flower arrangements and table settings, Kate was thinking deeply about how to create lasting positive change in the lives of vulnerable women. The drive to the shelter took Kate through some of London's most economically challenged neighborhoods, areas that rarely appeared in the glossy magazines that covered royal activities. As her car moved through streets lined with council housing and small shops struggling to survive, Kate felt a familiar sense of purpose that never accompanied her when she attended formal palace functions. Upon arriving at the shelter, Kate was greeted not by red carpets or formal receiving lines, but by Maria Santos, the shelter director, a woman in her 50s whose warm smile and firm handshake immediately conveyed both strength and compassion. Maria had dedicated her life to helping women escape abusive situations and rebuild their lives, and she had little patience for ceremonial gestures that didn't contribute to real solutions. "Your Royal Highness," Maria said as she led Kate through the shelter's modest but clean facilities, "I want you to know how much it means to our residents that you're taking the time to really understand their situations. Too often, people want to help from a distance, but you're willing to sit down and listen to their stories." As they walked through the shelter, Kate met women whose courage and resilience were truly inspiring. There was Jennifer, a young mother who had fled an abusive relationship with her two small children and was now training to become a nurse. There was an older woman who had endured decades of domestic violence before finally finding the strength to leave, and who now volunteered at the shelter to help other women find their own path to freedom. Each conversation Kate had was deeply personal and meaningful. She didn't just ask polite questions and move on. She listened intently to their stories, asked thoughtful follow-up questions, and shared her own insights about the challenges they faced. When Jennifer mentioned her struggles while attending nursing classes, Kate immediately began thinking about how her foundation could partner with local nurseries to provide support. When talked about the difficulty of rebuilding her social connections after years of isolation, Kate discussed programs that could help women in similar situations connect with supportive communities. Back at the palace, news of Kate's shelter visit was beginning to filter through the staff networks that kept the royal household informed about the activities of its various members. The reports were uniformly positive, with particular praise for Kate's genuine engagement with the women she met and her practical approach to addressing their needs. James, the head butler, found himself comparing these reports with the increasingly stressful atmosphere surrounding gala preparations. The contrast was becoming impossible to ignore, and it was creating a subtle but noticeable shift in the loyalty and enthusiasm of the palace staff. It's remarkable how the Princess of Wales manages to make such a positive impact without any of the drama or pressure that seems to surround other royal events, James mentioned quietly to Mrs. Henderson during their afternoon review of household schedules. Mrs. Henderson nodded knowingly. "She has a gift for focusing on what truly matters," she replied. "There's no pretense or artificiality in her approach. When she commits to helping people, you know it comes from a genuine place." These conversations, while conducted with the utmost discretion, reflected a growing awareness among the palace staff that they were witnessing something significant happening within the royal family. The two most prominent women in the household were pursuing very different approaches to their royal duties, and the results were becoming increasingly apparent to everyone who worked closely with them. As the afternoon progressed, received yet another piece of disappointing news. One of the celebrity performers she had been counting on to headline the gala had suffered a scheduling conflict that would prevent their attendance. The performer's management company had been apologetic but firm, and no amount of diplomatic pressure had been able to change their decision. Standing in her study, surrounded by elaborate plans and detailed schedules that now seemed increasingly fragile, felt a wave of frustration and helplessness that threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. She had invested so much of her personal reputation in this event, and the possibility of failure was becoming more real with each passing hour. The irony was not lost on her that while she struggled to convince celebrities to attend her elaborate gala, Kate was drawing genuine admiration and respect through simple acts of human compassion. The media coverage of Kate's shelter visit had been modest but overwhelmingly positive, focusing not on spectacle or glamour, but on substance and sincerity. As evening approached, found herself alone in her study once again, staring out at the London skyline and questioning whether her grand vision had been misguided from the beginning. The after-dark command that had once felt so powerful and decisive was beginning to feel like a burden that was too heavy to bear. The palace walls seemed to whisper with the conversations of staff members who were beginning to recognize that true leadership was not about commanding attention or orchestrating elaborate displays of power. It was about connecting with people's hearts, understanding their needs, and working tirelessly to make their lives better in real and meaningful ways. As the second part of this emotional tale concludes, the contrast between struggling grand gestures and Kate's authentic impact was becoming more pronounced with each passing day. The advantage was slowly but surely shifting toward the woman who understood that royal duty was not about demanding respect, but about earning it through genuine service to others. The third week of preparations brought with it a crisis that had not anticipated in her most pessimistic moments. The venue that had been secured for the gala, a historic mansion in central London that had once hosted the most exclusive social events of the Victorian era, was experiencing what the building management euphemistically called structural concerns. What this meant in practical terms was that a section of the ornate ceiling in the main ballroom had developed cracks that posed potential safety risks for large gatherings. Received this news while she was reviewing the final menu selections with the head chef, a moment that should have been one of the pleasant final touches to her elaborate planning process. Instead, her urgent appearance in the kitchen, her usual composed demeanor replaced by barely contained alarm, immediately signaled that another catastrophe was about to unfold. "Your Majesty, I'm afraid we have a significant problem with the venue," announced, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had already spent considerable time trying to find alternative solutions before bringing the crisis to his attention. "The building inspectors have raised serious concerns about the safety of hosting a large event in the main ballroom." The silver serving spoon that had been using to sample the soup course clattered to the floor, the sound echoing through the kitchen like a gunshot. For a moment, she stood frozen, her mind struggling to process the implications of what she had just heard. The venue was not just a location for her gala, it was an integral part of the vision she had created. The mansion's historic grandeur was supposed to provide the perfect backdrop for her triumphant evening, and the thought of having to find an alternative location at this late stage felt like a death blow to her carefully constructed plans. "How serious are these structural concerns?" asked, though she could tell from his expression that the situation was far more dire than she hoped. "Serious enough that the building's insurance company will not cover any event with more than 50 attendees," replied grimly. "And given that we have commitments for over 300 guests, this presents an insurmountable obstacle unless we can find an alternative venue immediately." The chef and kitchen staff, who had been bustling around the preparation area just moments before, had fallen silent, sensing the gravity of the situation unfolding before them. They had spent weeks perfecting the elaborate menu that had designed for the gala, and they could see months of their hard work potentially disappearing in an instant. Felt the walls of the kitchen closing in around her as the full implications of this disaster began to sink in. Finding an alternative venue that could accommodate 300 guests on such short notice would be nearly impossible under normal circumstances. But these were not normal circumstances. This was a royal event with security requirements, accessibility needs, and protocol considerations that severely limited the available options. "We need to contact every possible venue in London," said, her voice taking on a desperate edge that she had never allowed herself to display in front of staff members before. "Historic houses, hotels, event halls, anything that might be suitable. Cost is no object." But even as she gave these instructions, knew that money alone would not solve this problem. The most prestigious venues were booked months or even years in advance, and those that might have last-minute availability were unlikely to meet the standards that she had set for her grand vision. Meanwhile, Kate was experiencing a very different kind of afternoon. She had just concluded a remarkably successful meeting with the board of directors of the Children's Mental Health Foundation, an organization that had been working to expand mental health services for young people across the United Kingdom. The meeting had been productive beyond anyone's expectations, with board members volunteering resources, expertise, and connections that would significantly enhance the Foundation's ability to serve vulnerable children. Kate sat in the Foundation's modest conference room, surrounded by charts and graphs that documented the positive impact their programs were having on children's lives. Unlike the elaborate presentations that typically accompanied royal events, these materials focused entirely on substance. Decreased anxiety levels among participating children, improved academic performance, and stronger family relationships. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the Foundation's director, had worked in children's mental health for over 20 years, and she had never encountered a royal patron who demonstrated such genuine understanding of the complex challenges facing young people today. Kate didn't just lend her name and attend ceremonial events. She actively participated in developing programs, reviewing research, and meeting with the children and families who benefited from the Foundation's work. "Your Royal Highness," Dr. Mitchell said as they reviewed the latest program evaluation reports, "I have to tell you that the difference your involvement has made goes far beyond what we could have imagined. It's not just the funding or the public awareness, though those are certainly important. It's the fact that you truly understand what these children need and you're willing to advocate for them in ways that create real change." Kate smiled warmly, but her attention remained focused on the data before them. She had noticed a concerning trend in the reports that suggested certain demographic groups were not being reached as effectively by their current programs. Rather than simply accepting this limitation, she was determined to understand why these gaps existed and how they could be addressed. "I'm particularly concerned about these numbers," Kate said, pointing to a section of the report that showed lower participation rates among children from immigrant families. "What barriers are preventing these families from accessing our services?" Dr. Mitchell appreciated Kate's attention to detail and her willingness to tackle difficult questions. "We've identified several factors," she explained. "Language barriers are certainly an issue, but there are also cultural considerations, and frankly, some families are hesitant to seek mental health services due to stigma within their communities." Without hesitation, Kate began developing ideas for addressing these challenges. She suggested partnering with community leaders from various ethnic groups, developing materials in multiple languages, and creating culturally sensitive outreach programs that would meet families where they were rather than expecting them to adapt to existing services. This kind of thoughtful, practical problem-solving had become Kate's trademark approach to royal duties. Rather than focusing on grand gestures or high-profile events, she consistently demonstrated a willingness to engage with the complex, nuanced challenges that real people faced in their daily lives. As word of Kate's successful meeting with the Children's Mental Health Foundation began to circulate through the palace networks, it created yet another contrast with the increasingly desperate situation surrounding Scala. While Kate was building lasting partnerships and creating sustainable solutions to important problems, was fighting a losing battle against a series of logistical disasters that threatened to derail her entire vision. The palace communications team found themselves in an increasingly uncomfortable position as they tried to manage the competing narratives surrounding the two royal women. On one hand, they were tasked with promoting Scala as a groundbreaking event that would showcase the monarchy's relevance and influence. On the other hand, they were witnessing Kate's consistent success in generating positive, substantive news coverage without any of the manufactured drama that seemed to surround efforts. Charles, the head of Royal Communications, called an emergency meeting with his senior staff to discuss how to handle the growing crisis surrounding the gala venue. The meeting took place in the Communications Department's sleek conference room, where walls lined with framed newspaper headlines documenting decades of royal coverage served as a constant reminder of how quickly public opinion could shift. We need to be prepared for the possibility that this gala may need to be postponed or significantly scaled back, Charles announced to his team, his voice reflecting the gravity of the situation. Her Majesty is exploring alternative venues, but the options are extremely limited at this late stage. The Deputy Communications Director raised a concern that had been weighing on everyone's minds. Sir, we've already sent out press releases and confirmed interviews with several major media outlets. If we have to make significant changes or cancellations at this point, it's going to raise questions about the planning and execution of royal events. The implications of this were profound. The monarchy's reputation had always depended on its ability to execute formal events with flawless precision and dignified ceremony. Any suggestion that a major royal gala had been poorly planned or inadequately managed would provide ammunition for critics who questioned the institution's continued relevance. Charles nodded grimly, understanding all too well the potential consequences of the unfolding crisis. We'll need to craft a communications strategy that focuses on the charitable aspects of the event rather than the venue or the celebrity attendance, he said. But honestly, we're in damage control mode at this point. As the communications team struggled with the fallout from difficulties, Kate was generating positive headlines without any effort or manipulation whatsoever. Her visit to the women's shelter had resulted in thoughtful feature articles about domestic violence support services. Her meeting with the Children's Mental Health Foundation had prompted several newspapers to publish editorials about the importance of mental health resources for young people. The contrast was becoming impossible for anyone within the palace to ignore. While elaborate efforts to command attention and generate headlines were falling apart, Kate's authentic engagement with important causes was naturally attracting the kind of positive coverage that money and planning could never guarantee. Mrs. Henderson, the head housekeeper, found herself fielding an unusual number of requests from staff members who wanted to be assigned to duties that would bring them into contact with Kate rather than. The requests were never explicitly stated in terms of preference, but the pattern was unmistakable. The palace staff, who had dedicated their careers to serving the royal family, were increasingly drawn to working with the royal who treated them with genuine respect and appreciation. There's something about the Princess of Wales that makes everyone want to do their best work, Mrs. Henderson confided to James during one of their evening conversations. She has this way of making you feel like your contribution actually matters, like you're part of something important rather than just following orders. James nodded in agreement, remembering the numerous occasions when Kate had personally thanked him for his service or asked about his family. These small gestures, which cost nothing but meant everything to the recipients, had created a level of loyalty and dedication among the staff that could not be commanded or manufactured. As the third part of this emotional tale draws to a close, the contrast between the two women's approaches to royal duty had become a defining characteristic of life within the palace. After-Dark Command, built on elaborate planning and grand gestures, was crumbling under the weight of its own ambitions. Meanwhile, Kate's quiet, consistent focus on genuine service was steadily building a foundation of respect and admiration that proved far more durable than any single spectacular event. The palace walls that had witnessed centuries of royal triumphs and failures were witnessing yet another lesson in the difference between authority that is demanded and leadership that is earned. As the crisis surrounding the gala venue continued to unfold, it was becoming clear that true power lay not in the ability to command attention, but in the capacity to create meaningful, lasting positive change in the lives of others. The morning that would forever change the dynamics within the royal household began with what appeared to be a miracle for troubled gala plans. Burst into the Queen Consort's private study with news that seemed too good to be true. The Royal Opera House had suffered a last-minute cancellation of a major production, leaving their magnificent auditorium available for exactly the date needed. "Your Majesty," announced breathlessly, her usual composed demeanor replaced by obvious relief and excitement, "the Royal Opera House has just contacted us. They've had a cancellation for the exact date of our gala, and they're willing to make their facilities available to us. Looked up from the pile of rejection letters and venue inquiries that had consumed her morning, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. The Royal Opera House was not just any venue. It was one of the most prestigious cultural institutions in London, a place that would lend instant credibility and grandeur to any event held within its walls. "Are you certain?" asked, her voice betraying a mixture of hope and disbelief. "What are their requirements? What will it cost?" Consulted her notes, her expression growing slightly more reserved as she delivered the details. "They're willing to accommodate us, but there are significant restrictions. The event must conclude by 10 o'clock in the evening due to their licensing agreements, and will be limited to their existing catering partners. Additionally, the acoustics and layout are designed for operatic performances, not social gatherings." Even as outlined these limitations, felt a surge of renewed confidence. The Royal Opera House represented exactly the kind of prestigious association she had been seeking for her gala. The venue's reputation for excellence and cultural sophistication would automatically elevate her event, regardless of the attendance numbers or celebrity participation that had been causing her so much anxiety. "Book it immediately," instructed, her voice carrying authority that had been absent during the recent weeks of crisis management. "We'll adapt our plans to work with their requirements. This is exactly the kind of venue that will establish the proper tone for what we're trying to achieve." But as the initial excitement of securing the venue began to fade, the practical challenges of adapting her elaborate vision to fit the opera house's restrictions became apparent. The intimate social atmosphere she had envisioned would be difficult to achieve in a venue designed for audiences to sit in rows facing a stage. The elaborate dining arrangements would need to be completely reconsidered to accommodate the theater's layout. Most significantly, the 10 o'clock conclusion time would compress the entire evening into a much shorter than originally planned. Meanwhile, Kate was facing a very different kind of opportunity. She had received an invitation to speak at an international conference on childhood trauma, an event that would bring together leading experts, policymakers, and advocates from around the world. The conference organizers had specifically requested Kate's participation because of her demonstrated commitment to understanding and addressing the complex challenges facing vulnerable children. Unlike gala, this invitation had not been sought or orchestrated. It had emerged naturally from the relationships Kate had built through her consistent, authentic engagement with childhood mental health issues. The conference organizers had watched her work closely for months, impressed not by grand gestures or high-profile events, but by her willingness to engage deeply with difficult topics and her ability to bridge the gap between academic research and practical solutions. Dr. Elizabeth, the conference director, had personally extended the invitation during a phone call that reflected the genuine respect Kate had earned within the professional community. "Your Royal Highness," Doctor had explained, "we believe your unique perspective as both a royal patron and a hands-on advocate could provide insights that our attendees would find invaluable. We're not looking for a ceremonial address, but rather a substantive discussion of how policy and practice can work together to better serve children who have experienced trauma." Kate had accepted the invitation immediately, recognizing it as an opportunity to contribute meaningfully to a conversation that could have lasting impact on children's lives around the world. She had spent the following weeks preparing for her presentation, consulting with researchers, reviewing case studies, and speaking with practitioners who worked directly with traumatized children. Her approach to preparation stood in stark contrast to focus on logistics and image management. Where worried about flower arrangements and celebrity attendance, Kate immersed herself in research about evidence-based interventions for childhood trauma. Where concerned herself with media coverage and social positioning, Kate focused on understanding how her platform could be used to advance knowledge and improve outcomes for vulnerable children. As news of both events began to circulate within royal circles, the differences in approach and focus became a topic of quiet discussion among palace staff and royal watchers. Gala was being promoted as a glamorous social event that would raise funds for charity while showcasing the monarchy's continued relevance and influence. Kate's conference presentation was being anticipated as a substantive contribution to an important professional dialogue about child welfare. The contrast was particularly striking to those who worked closely with both women. While staff found themselves managing increasingly complex logistics and damage control scenarios, Kate's team was supporting research and preparation that would contribute to meaningful policy discussions. The energy surrounding the two events was markedly different: stress and anxiety versus purposeful preparation. Charles and his communications team found themselves in the uncomfortable position of trying to generate equal enthusiasm for both events, while managing the obvious differences in their substance and public appeal. The gala required aggressive promotion and careful spin to maintain the illusion of success, despite the various setbacks. Kate's conference presentation generated positive interest naturally, with minimal promotional effort required. "We need to be strategic about how we position these two events," Charles explained to his senior staff during their weekly planning meeting. "The gala needs to be framed as a celebration of charitable giving and royal tradition, while the Princess of Wales's conference presentation should be positioned as evidence of the monarchy's intellectual engagement with important social issues." But even as Charles tried to create balanced messaging around both events, it was becoming clear to everyone involved that one represented genuine substance, while the other was increasingly resembling an elaborate performance designed primarily to enhance image and status. The differences became even more pronounced when Kate received an unexpected phone call from Dr. James, a leading researcher in childhood trauma who had read about her upcoming conference presentation. Doctor had spent his career studying the long-term effects of adverse childhood experiences, and he was eager to discuss how Kate's advocacy work could incorporate the latest research findings. "Your Royal Highness," Doctor explained during their hour-long conversation, "I've been following your work with childhood mental health initiatives, and I'm impressed by your focus on evidence-based approaches. I wondered if you might be interested in discussing how recent research on neuroplasticity could inform trauma recovery programs for children." Kate not only accepted his offer to collaborate, but suggested that they arrange for him to brief her team about incorporating neuroscience research into practical intervention programs. This conversation led to additional connections with researchers and practitioners who were eager to work with someone who demonstrated genuine understanding of their field. These organic professional relationships stood in sharp contrast to the increasingly desperate attempts by his team to secure high-profile endorsements and celebrity participation for the gala. While Kate was building substantive partnerships based on shared commitment to important work, was struggling to maintain the illusion of prestige and influence despite mounting evidence that her grand vision was not resonating with the people she most wanted to impress. The palace staff, who had initially maintained careful neutrality about the two women's different approaches, were finding it increasingly difficult to ignore the contrasts they witnessed daily. James, the head butler, found himself repeatedly impressed by the caliber of people who sought out opportunities to work with Kate, while he watched teams struggle to maintain enthusiasm among those whose support they needed most. "There's something to be said for earning respect rather than expecting it," James mentioned quietly to Mrs. Henderson during one of their private conversations. "The Princess of Wales never demands anything from anyone, but people seem eager to contribute to her work because they believe in what she's doing." Mrs. Henderson nodded thoughtfully, remembering the numerous occasions when she had observed Kate treating every staff member with genuine respect and appreciation. She understands that real leadership is about inspiring people to want to do their best, not forcing them to comply with demands. As the fourth part of this emotional tale unfolds, the two royal women were pursuing increasingly divergent paths toward their respective goals. Had secured a prestigious venue for her gala, but the event was requiring ever more elaborate efforts to maintain the facade of success. Kate was preparing for a conference presentation that had emerged naturally from her authentic engagement with important work, supported by relationships built on mutual respect and shared purpose. The palace walls seemed to echo with the growing recognition among staff and observers that true authority could not be manufactured through grand gestures and elaborate planning. Instead, it emerged naturally from consistent demonstration of genuine commitment to serving others and making positive differences in their lives. As both events approached, it was becoming clear that the real test of royal effectiveness lay not in the ability to command attention or orchestrate spectacular displays, but in the capacity to create lasting positive impact through authentic engagement with the challenges facing the communities they served. The advantage was shifting decisively toward the woman who understood that real power came from empowering others, not from demanding their admiration or compliance. The evening of gala arrived with all the fanfare and anticipation that months of elaborate planning could produce. Yet beneath the surface glamour lay an undercurrent of tension that even the most skilled royal observers could sense. The Royal Opera House had been transformed as much as its historic architecture would allow, with elaborate floral arrangements masking the venue's obvious unsuitability for intimate social gathering. The red carpet stretched from the street to the entrance, lined with photographers whose enthusiasm seemed forced rather than genuine, as if they too understood that this event was more about appearance than substance. Stood in the Opera House's royal box, resplendent in a gown that had been designed specifically for this evening, its sapphire blue fabric catching the light from the crystal chandeliers above. Her jewelry, borrowed from the royal collection, sparkled with the accumulated wealth and prestige of centuries of monarchy. Yet despite this magnificent exterior, her eyes betrayed the anxiety that had been building for weeks as she surveyed the auditorium below. The attendance, while respectable by normal standards, fell far short of the packed house that had envisioned during those confident planning sessions months earlier. Empty seats scattered throughout the orchestra section served as visible reminders of the invitations that had been declined, the celebrities who had found scheduling conflicts, and the dignitaries whose enthusiasm had proven less reliable than anticipated. Stood beside her, maintaining the professional composure that years of royal service had ingrained. But even she could not completely hide her concern as she watched facade of confidence beginning to crack. The evening that was supposed to establish as a formidable force within the royal family was instead highlighting the limitations of command-based leadership and the fragility of manufactured prestige. "Your Majesty," whispered discreetly, "the program is running approximately 20 minutes behind schedule due to the extended cocktail reception. We may need to adjust the timing of your remarks to ensure we conclude by 10 o'clock as required by the venue." This news struck like a physical blow. Her planned remarks had been carefully crafted to serve as the evening's centerpiece, a speech that would demonstrate her command of important issues while showcasing her ability to inspire and lead. The prospect of having to cut short this crucial element of her presentation felt like a betrayal of everything she had worked so hard to achieve. "We will not be adjusting the speech," replied firmly, though her voice carried a tremor that betrayed her inner turmoil. "The venue requirements will simply have to accommodate our needs. This evening is far too important to be compromised by arbitrary time restrictions." But even as she spoke these defiant words, could see the skeptical expressions on the faces of the venue staff who were responsible for ensuring compliance with the Opera House's licensing agreements. The reality of her situation was becoming increasingly clear. Despite all her planning and preparation, she did not possess the kind of natural authority that could bend circumstances to her will through sheer force of personality. Meanwhile, across the city, Kate was experiencing a very different kind of evening. The International Conference on Childhood Trauma had concluded its formal sessions earlier in the day, but Kate had chosen to extend her participation by attending an informal dinner with conference participants. This dinner, held in a modest hotel conference room rather than a grand venue, brought together researchers, practitioners, and advocates who shared a common commitment to improving outcomes for vulnerable children. Kate sat at a round table with Dr. Sarah Mitchell, Dr. Elizabeth, and several other experts whose work had impressed her throughout the conference. The conversation flowed naturally from professional topics to personal observations, creating the kind of authentic connection that no amount of planning or orchestration could manufacture. "Your presentation this afternoon was remarkable," Dr. Mitchell commented as they shared a simple but well-prepared meal. "You managed to bridge the gap between policy and practice in a way that made complex research accessible to everyone in the room. That's a rare gift, and it's clear that you've invested significant time in truly understanding these issues." Kate smiled warmly, but her attention remained focused on learning from the expertise of those around her. "I have to admit that I learned as much as I contributed today," she replied. "Doctor's research on resilience factors was particularly enlightening. It's given me several ideas about how we might restructure some of our existing programs to better support children's natural capacity for recovery." This kind of thoughtful engagement had characterized Kate's entire approach to the conference. Rather than delivering a ceremonial address and departing, she had attended multiple sessions, asked probing questions during panel discussions, and sought out opportunities to learn from experts whose work she genuinely respected. Her presentation, when it came, had been substantive and well-informed, demonstrating a depth of understanding that impressed even the most experienced professionals in the field. The contrast between the two events could not have been more pronounced. Whilst Gala struggled with logistical challenges and forced enthusiasm, Kate's conference participation had generated the kind of organic professional respect and admiration that money could not buy. The researchers and advocates who had spent time with Kate left the conference eager to collaborate with her on future initiatives, while many of Gala attendees were already making polite excuses about early departures. Back at the Opera House, the evening's program was indeed running behind schedule, and the pressure to conclude by the venue's deadline was creating visible stress among the event organizers. Its planned speech, which was supposed to serve as the evening's climactic moment, was being compressed and rushed in ways that undermined its intended impact. When finally took the stage to deliver her remarks, she found herself addressing an audience that was already beginning to show signs of restlessness and fatigue. The elaborate lighting and staging that had been designed to create a sense of grandeur instead highlighted the artificiality of the entire production. Her words, carefully crafted to inspire and motivate, fell flat in the vast auditorium whose acoustics were designed for operatic performance rather than intimate communication. "Ladies and," began, her voice amplified by the opera house's sound system, but somehow lacking the warmth and authenticity that could truly connect with her audience. "Tonight represents a watershed moment for charitable giving and royal leadership. Through your generous support, we are demonstrating that the monarchy remains a vital force for positive change in our society." But even as she spoke these words, could sense that her message was not resonating with the audience in the way she had envisioned. The elaborate venue, rather than lending gravitas to her remarks, seemed to dwarf her presence and make her words feel hollow and performative. The charitable auction that followed her speech reflected the same disparity between ambition and reality that had characterized the entire evening. While the items being auctioned were valuable, and the cause was worthy, the bidding lacked the enthusiastic competition that had anticipated. The final fundraising total, while respectable, fell significantly short of the ambitious goals that had been set during the planning process. As the evening drew to its mandated conclusion, found herself accepting congratulations and praise that felt perfunctory rather than genuine. The conversations were polite and appropriate, but they lacked the warmth and authenticity that would have indicated true success. She had succeeded in organizing a formal royal event, but she had failed to create the kind of meaningful impact that would justify the enormous investment of time, energy, and resources that had gone into its planning. Meanwhile, Kate's evening was concluding with invitations to collaborate on research projects, requests for her input on policy recommendations, and expressions of genuine appreciation for her substantive contributions to important conversations about child welfare. The relationships she had built during the conference would continue long after the formal event ended, creating opportunities for ongoing impact that extended far beyond any single gathering. The palace staff who had worked on both events found themselves drawing inevitable comparisons between their experiences. Those who had supported Gala described an atmosphere of stress, pressure, and artificial urgency that had made their work feel more like crisis management than professional service. Those who had assisted with Kate's conference participation reported a sense of purpose and satisfaction that came from supporting work that clearly made a meaningful difference. James, reflecting on the evening's events during his final rounds through the palace, found himself thinking about the fundamental differences between authority that was demanded and leadership that was earned. This gala had been an elaborate attempt to command respect and admiration through spectacle and grandeur, but it had ultimately highlighted the limitations of this approach. Kate's conference presentation had demonstrated a very different model of royal service, one based on genuine expertise, authentic engagement, and humble commitment to learning and growth. The positive impact of her participation would extend far beyond the conference itself, influencing research, policy, and practice in ways that could improve countless children's lives. As the final part of this emotional tale draws to a close, the contrast between the two women's approaches to royal duty had become a defining characteristic of the contemporary monarchy. This after-dark command, built on elaborate planning and grand gestures, had achieved its immediate objective of organizing a prestigious event, but it had failed to create the kind of lasting impact or genuine respect that true leadership required. Kate's quiet, consistent focus on authentic service and meaningful engagement had steadily built a foundation of professional respect and public admiration that proved far more valuable than any amount of manufactured pageantry. The advantage had shifted decisively toward the woman who understood that real power came not from commanding attention, but from empowering others and creating positive change in their lives. The palace walls that had witnessed centuries of royal triumphs and failures had witnessed yet another chapter in the ongoing story of how true authority is earned through service, rather than demanded through ceremony. As both women continued their royal duties in the days and weeks following these pivotal events, it became clear that the future of the monarchy belonged to those who could demonstrate genuine commitment to the welfare of others, rather than merely the ability to orchestrate impressive displays of wealth and prestige. The shift in advantage was complete, measured not in headlines or social media mentions, but in the lasting positive impact that would continue to benefit the communities and causes that Kate had served with such authentic dedication. Her victory was not over personally, but over an outdated model of royal authority that relied on commands rather than inspiration, demands rather than service, and spectacle rather than substance.